Using the NYPD's own data, the Legal Aid Society pointed to numbers that show roughly 91% of reported stop-and-frisk procedures in 2020 involved New Yorkers of color, with black New Yorkers making up a majority of the stops, despite making up less than a quarter of New York City's population.
Not only have these stop-and-frisk procedures disparately impacted communities of color, but in over 95% of those cases, no contraband was even found. And so we have to ask, why are we still engaging in these practices?
Following a landmark federal class action suit challenging its stop-and-frisk practices, the NYPD is required to report data on stops officers make. The decision came after a judge ruled in 2013 that the department had engaged in a pattern of racially discriminatory and unconstitutional stops.
As I like to say, the reports of the death of race-based stop-and-frisk were greatly exaggerated. That's kind of a paraphrasing Mark Twain, I guess.
Attorney Darius Charney of the Center for Constitutional Rights was lead counsel on that case in 2013, when 80% of all stop-and-frisk stops were of Black and Latinx New Yorkers.
Fast forward to 2020, 2021, and we are still well over 80% of stops being conducted on Black and Latinx New Yorkers. So the racial disparities, the severe racial disparities in who's being stopped have not gone down at all over these past 8 years.
In fact, the number of stops recently is a fraction of what they were a decade ago, down even more so last year due to the pandemic. But last year, a federal monitor appointed by the courts warned that stops were being grossly undercounted because of the way the NYPD was categorizing differing interactions between officers and civilians.
So that means that if the underreported stops are skewed heavily towards Blacks and Latinx folks, and the data that we have is, in putting those two things together, you could have just really serious disparities that we don't even know the true extent of it.
Speaking on 1010 Wins today, the police commissioner did not address specific racial disparities in stop-and-frisk numbers, but did point out a record number of gun arrests in 2020.
There is no right number, the correct number. It's depending on what we're facing on the street, who's deployed, how they're deployed. Clearly you want whatever you're doing to do it appropriately and constitutionally and building trust in the community.
Tamsin and Corey, the Legal Aid Society, also pointing out that some of the New York neighborhoods with the most stops were also those most impacted by COVID-19.